Landward. So let's wait for folks to
Thanks,
get
everybody.
added.
Welcome to the Rocky Habitat Working Group meeting on February 25th, 2021. We'll give it a minute here for folks to join. And we'll go around and we'll do introductions from the working group here after we get a few people on.
Yeah, they're still being added, Charlie, so just hold a little bit longer. All right, I'm not seeing any more being added immediately, Charlie, so I think all those in the queue are with us.
All right, welcome everybody. My name is Charlie Plavin. I am the chair of the Rocky Habitat Working Group for the Ocean Policy Advisory Council. It is February 25th or 26th, right? 2021. And we're on our second day of our evaluations for the Rocky Habitat proposals. So go ahead to our next slide. We're going to kick it off with a round of introductions for those that are joining from the public of our working group, our Rocky Habitat rock stars, as I like to call them. We'll just go straight down the list as they are on the slide, and I'll have each person introduce themselves. My apologies. Again, my name is Charlie Plavin. I'm the chair. I work as the Oregon Policy Manager for Surfrider Foundation, and I am the non-consumptive recreational user representative on OPAC. And I will turn it over to Tom to introduce himself.
Yeah, Tom Calvanese here. I work for Oregon State University as the station manager for the Port Orford Field Station. I also work for the Oregon Kelp Alliance as the coordinator. And on this group, I focus on coastal research. And I'll pass it on to Carrie.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carrie Morgan. I am the Director of Education and Volunteer Services at the Oregon Coast Aquarium, and I represent education on this committee. And Andrea, I don't know if she's here yet. Okay, then Walter.
All right. Thanks, Carrie. Walter Chuck. I'm a commissioner with the Port of Newport, and I represent ports, marine transportation, and navigation on OPAC. Dave Fox, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, this is Dave Fox. I'm with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Marine Resources Program stationed in Newport. I'll pass it on to Laurel.
Laurel Hillman, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, and I'll pass it on to Dave Lacey.
Dave, I saw you come on and off mute. Are you having trouble with your audio?
Yeah, with the South Coast, at least around Gold Beach, is roaming, and then we're having major internet issues down here. So I don't know if I'll be on for very long.
Well, that's unfortunate. Nope, sorry to hear about that.
Sorry, Dave Lacey with the Visitors Association.
Ann Dulnier, Marine Affairs Coordinator with the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and I'll pass it to Scott.
Scott McMullen, Public at Large. I'm from Astoria. And next to Sean.
Sean Stevenson with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I work out of the Newport office, Oregon Coast National Wildlife Refuge Complex. Pass it off to Dick.
Good afternoon, everybody. Dick Vanderschaft with the Nature Conservancy. I represent conservation interests on the Rocky Habitat Working Group. And off to Chris Wall, who probably is not on. Okay.
So let's circle back to Andrea.
Andrea.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Andrea Celentano, Oregon Department of State Land. Oh, sorry. Pass it to Laurel, I think.
Nope. Okay. I think we're back around to Frank.
Sorry.
Hi, everyone. I'm Frank Burris. I'm with Oregon State University Extension Service and Oregon Sea Grant, and I'm the facilitator for this meeting.
And Patty, do you want?
Hi, this is Patty Snow. I'm the Oregon Coastal Program Manager. Hello, everyone.
All right, I believe that completes our intros.
Except for me, I'm Michael Moses, Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, and I'm the Rocky Shores Coordinator.
So are we ready to go, Andy?
I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah, before we jump in, again, we just wanted to acknowledge all the other parts of this process, which is the public and many different groups that have been part of this process and really steering the work of this working group in many ways, and putting countless hours into their proposals, their outreach for those, and otherwise. It's pretty significant, the work that this update has attracted and the amount of individuals that have contributed. So a big thanks to all the individuals out there, those who are listening in, but to all your colleagues and to other friends of yours that have worked on these proposals that were in front of us today and yesterday. Now we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, thank you for that, Charlie. That's good to remind people that we're mid-process here, and there's been a lot of work leading up to this. So it's good to have that recognition. So yesterday we went through most of our proposals. For those of you that weren't here, we got 10 out of 12 done. We have 2 more to go through, Blacklock Point and Crook Point. So we're going to jump right into Blacklock Point. And Moses, would you lead us off on that?
Indeed. All righty. Once again, folks, thank you very much for sitting through this. If you had to prop your eyeballs open toward the end of yesterday, I totally understand, but thank you for sticking with it.
Mm-hmm.
So 2 left, as Frank mentioned. Blacklock Point is going to be the first one. Second one will be Crook Point, Mack, Reef. Both were submitted by the same proposers. So there are a lot of similarities and a bit of overlap in their management plans. So that's why we're reviewing them together. They're also both on the South Coast, as many of you already know. So Blacklock Point Marine Conservation Area. This site is fairly remote. It includes about a mile stretch of cliffs to the north. So that's that kind of sliver of blue you see in the proposed designation there. Very limited access at this site. You can access it through the Flores Lake State Natural Area there on the landward side by a 1.5 mile trail, or you can take a 2 mile walk from the north down the beach, or a 1 mile walk up from the south, starting at the mouth of the River Sixes, which is also a fairly undeveloped area. So needless to say, site use is very low at this site. It is known to be used by some tribal nations for traditional fishing and cultural resource collection. There are some native archaeological sites on site, but it seems as though there may be few artifacts left there, unfortunately. So the part of the interests expressed by the proposer who submitted this is, once again, seabird nesting success, harbor seal haulouts, on habitat protection, and they specifically called out ecosystem-based management, which is one of the focuses of the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy. Also, they're looking to continue supporting traditional use of the site and to protect those archaeological sites. For recommendations for site management, no changes were proposed to harvest regulations at the site, and also no additional restrictions on human use activities. The focus here is education enforcement through education. So the group is looking to form a friends group with a memorandum of understanding with the state to conduct those stewardship activities that would involve training, curricula, more frequent patrols as part of their education or their enforcement efforts, update some signage around the area, conduct outreach programs that focus on development, training, and implementation of this volunteer stewardship program, and to support any agencies involved at the site in adaptive management. They'd also proposed a monitoring program at the site which prioritizes the needs outlined in the Oregon Nearshore Strategy. They would like to track use, conditions, habitat, A few species were specifically called out of interest, namely abalone, the pycnopodia, sunflower sea stars, black oyster catchers, snowy plovers, marbled murrelets, pinniped species present, otters, and whales. So as far as a summary of the agency feasibility analysis and the working group observations, for agency analysis, once again, this issue that we brought up several times yesterday is the landward boundaries. They asked that the landward boundary be considered at the statutory vegetation line, which on the northern portion would be at the top of the cliffs potentially. But again, the whole site abuts parkland on the landward side, which does not define a statutory vegetation line. So that boundary would need to be reconciled with agencies. The monitoring aspects are quite ambitious, but would be potentially beneficial to the agencies as well as others. The proposed upland management goals outlined in the proposal, the agencies felt those were too broad and outside the scope of the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy. Agency support for the volunteer programs would need to be clarified, the roles that the agencies would play there, but the agencies did express that their capacity for engaging those programs at this site would be fairly limited. There are many enforcement challenges seen at Black Lock Point, particularly given the limited site access and the difficulty of accessing some of the rocky habitat, the intertidal rocky habitat. Could present many challenges as well as safety concerns, and response capacity in the area is extremely limited. There's effectively no U.S. Fish and Wildlife law enforcement presence, at least if you would need it in a timely manner. So there's concerns that by designating the site and changing any sort of management there, we could potentially attract attention to the site, which could then increase enforcement expectations. However, the site use is already very low. The site also lacks proper infrastructure to facilitate some of the proposed stewardship activities. So I think group visits were called out or other sorts of outreach, education, engagement type of activities, but there's no sorts of infrastructure like parking lots or anything that would really facilitate those kinds of activities on site. For working group observations, the working group felt that the goals, the measurable outcomes were both well stated, reasonably achievable. There's a very clear focus on education goals, which was seen as positive. Very strong on non-regulatory management measures, all this enforcement through education. But there's really no change from status quo management without some changes to harvest regulations. The site's very remote, very low use. Access is challenging, as I've outlined. So the ability to really interact with visitors seems limited. And so it's unsure that how that really supports some of their site goals. So, and also the volunteer programs, there's concern and how those will be supported, whether it's through agencies or otherwise. The programs proposed aren't set up yet at this site. And generally, the effectiveness of the site designation here was brought up, given that there's no regulatory changes to the measures proposed, and so whether or not that's potentially at odds with some of their site goals. So I'll pause there to allow any members of the working group to add additional clarifications or context to any of that.
So does anybody have any observations or clarifications to those working group observations so that we can add to this list?
Got it. Seems like this is a little bit of an orphan. It doesn't really fit into marine education because of the difficult access. You can't really get people there. But if it weren't for that, it would seem like it would fit a marine garden better than this. And so I think it's sort of a situation where we don't have a good fit. Not blaming the proposers, just that our process doesn't seem to line up with this proposal.
Thank you, Scott, for that comment.
Charlie?
I want to recognize that a lot of the things that were raised, I think, in observations and agency analysis here, I think were also recognized by the proposer as challenges as well. And so I think there's a number of these things that the proposer spoke very directly to. They may not have given the perfect solution or known what the solution was, but I do want to acknowledge that a lot of these things actually were identified by the proposer. And I just wanted to make sure that that was supported and recognized, that, you know, with respect to low access and some of the challenges of site visitation, particularly trying to be ahead of the curve, I think was a term I heard a lot in this proposal. And it's something I think about for a lot of the sites is those wild spaces that maybe aren't as impacted today, but will be in the future. And so, you know, there's that paradox of how to protect something that doesn't maybe need protecting today, but will need it in the future. And I think that's the interesting paradox of a site like this too, and beyond its low accessibility.
Thank you, Charlie. Walter?
Yeah, I think it was brought up on some of these other ones about the volunteer pool coastwide to manage and man some of these programs, and the remoteness might be a barrier to getting a full program going also.
Thank you, Walter. Any other observations, comments?
Dick Vanderschaft.
Yeah, thanks. I think one other aspect of this site is that it's in relatively close proximity to Cape Blanco as well. Cape Blanco, a well-known site ecologically, as well as known by the public because of the state parks there too. Doesn't necessarily negate the importance of Black Lock Point, but again, it is within relatively close to Blanco was another site which was recommended, as we noted. So I think in some ways it helps, it kind of confounds between the two in terms of looking at are both sites equally important? Is one more important than the other? They have different values, but I think it certainly, at least in my mind, it posed some challenges for us for full evaluation, or not so much evaluation, but to ranking them in terms of importance and how they may fit into an overall program.
Thank you, Dick. Any other comments? Andy, is there anybody in the waiting list?
Looks like Dave Lacey has a comment.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. This is one of those areas that's almost a pristine site, which if that's what you look for when you want a conservation area, if you're looking for one of those as an example of an area that's not already been trampled and beat up a bit, this would fit that bill pretty well for that. That's all I want to mention.
Thank you, Dave.
And Tom.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that there was clearly a lot of research and work and thought went into this proposal, and I think it really touches on a lot of the themes that are found throughout the strategy, and things that we've discussed throughout meetings, in particular, in the last day and now today. I'm sorry, yesterday and today, and I hope that we'll get sort of a chance to talk a little bit more about some of the recommendations we might consider on a sort of coastwide basis. Because, for example, Charlie called out this sort of focus on ecosystem-based management, which is sort of a theme throughout the strategy and one that appears in this proposal as well. So, I just want to acknowledge that this pretty comprehensive proposal. There's a lot in it, and I guess also echo sort of some of the things that Charlie said and what Dave just said about this sort of tricky balance between sort of, I guess I'd call it sort of proactive protection and creating sort of an attraction around some of the activities you're trying to actually mitigate. So I think that's one of the puzzles we've been thinking about and trying to solve as we go through the process. And I'm not sure I have a sort of resolution or a recommendation necessarily, but just something I'm sort of noticing, in particular here on the South Coast, kind of like trying to wrap our head around how do we square that circle and figure out the best strategy forward. And then I guess last thing I'll echo is what Dick said about the proximity of this site to Cape Blanco and just the infrastructure and accessibility of that site and how it lends itself to some of the things that are being proposed. Even though also in that case there are things that need to be resolved. So I'll end there and give it back to the group.
Thank you, Tom. Carrie, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I guess I would just, thinking about the ecosystem-based management and in relation to these other sites, without any change in regulations and keeping it status quo, that those two things don't seem to go together for me. If we're trying to do ecosystem-based management and keep it pristine, why would we not want to exclude harvest in here? And because what we're looking at is everything on the land side, which is education, which, as we've noted in other proposals, you can do education without a designation. And if that's the main goal, what's the effectiveness of the designation? So I guess that's sort of what I'm wrestling with a little bit with this proposal.
Others?
I don't see any other hands at the moment.
Okay, let's go forward to the recommendations then.
All right, so the considerations that we've pulled out here from that would need to be called out explicitly for any sort of recommendation. The enforcement challenges, the capacity and support for volunteer programs, just having that more firm, and then a balance between the site goals and the level of site use as it is. So are there any others that folks would like to add or modify?
Walter, and then Laurel.
Yeah, I'd just like to further stress that what does a designation get beyond status quo with no restrictions? And the proposers say this is a relatively intact site, very remote, very pristine. How does that balance with starting an education program and basically inviting people there? To me, that's kind of counterintuitive. I'll leave it there.
Laurel?
Yeah, I was just gonna point out that we had discussed, I think, in the agency analysis, also the infrastructure challenges associated with that trail and signage, funding, lack of funding for additional signage. But I also wanted to point out that it is listed in the state natural areas plan. So we had discussed that as well in the agency review, that designation does exist currently. There's different types of designation, but it is listed in the plan.
And Laurel, can you just give us a brief synopsis of what that protection means to the site?
I am not the expert to discuss that. I have sent folks information and links to the plan. It doesn't have additional protections on top of the state park, state natural areas designation per se, but it is, if you want a designation, it does have a designation that recognizes its importance as a natural area.
Okay, thank you, Laurel.
So we have Dave Fox and then Dave Lacey.
Yeah, I just want to mention too that at least during our earlier discussions, there was a lot of discussion about the reference to upland activities in the proposal. And it's still unclear to me as if it was proposing, that that this proposal would, when implemented, would influence upland activities or not. I know there was some concern about a kind of marine proposal, having any kind of at least a regulatory effect on activities already regulated through other means. And I don't recall what the outcome of that discussion was, but it seems like it needs a little clarification in the proposal.
Yeah, Dave, just to acknowledge that, I think that was one of the pieces of advice that we asked Steve Shipsey about, was kind of the application of TSP up into the shorelands. And he said that he would be thinking about that and then getting back to us. So that is still on my list to follow up with him on. Dave Lacey and then Andrea.
Thank you. Does the state natural area designation, would that help with some of these infrastructure challenges as far as like trail construction or signage funding, Laurel?
It doesn't enable to give us any additional funding. The trail construction problems there are partially a function of, that landscape and other challenges that I've brought up before. It gets very wet in the winter, and there are challenges that prevent us from doing additional trail construction there.
Thank you for that. And that part of the reason we don't, as an organization, send people that way is because of the sensitivity of the area and the really the difficulty in getting there in the wintertime, like you mentioned, with the water there.
Yeah, the wintertime challenges. There's lots of very sensitive vegetation and other resources. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And just to be clear, those are really on the upland component of the park, kind of in between the parking lot, which is like a mile or a mile and a half from the top of the cliffs before you even think about getting down into the intertidal area, at least from the site that's up on the top of the hill to the east of where you can see. I think that little barcode kind of obscures maybe the beginning of the airfield that's there. So just to clarify, that issue is, well above the intertidal area. Andrea.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Dave was saying, and Andy, I think that you spoke to most of it, but maybe it should be a bullet point on this list, because I do remember the conversation that we had about it in terms of the agency feasibility analysis, and it's not, from DSL's perspective, necessarily an issue with our agency. It's just that it affects a lot of other entities like local government and the Department of Forestry and people that aren't necessarily at the table. So I definitely would want that to be a point that we would follow up on, just like the intent of the proposal to apply to the uplands and like clarity around that.
I think I would rather put that as an overarching comment that will apply to all sites rather than associated with an individual site per se, because I think that's relevant to everyone across the board.
I think that's fair, and yes. The other proposals didn't specifically mention it in terms of policy R that we created, in terms of development activities being like near an area or submerged aquatic vegetation. So it is specifically listed in this policy, but I definitely think that should apply to any recommendation. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm seeing it recognized. Dave's intention was to have it be a bullet point on this slide. So let's go ahead and add it for this one. And but the feedback that we received from Steve will apply more broadly. So I saw Walter and then Charlie's hands. You're on mute still, Walter.
Hey, Andy. Sorry, Andy. I want to expand on that change in management from status quo, and it's regarding the goals. If all these, it's basically status quo. The goals are already being met, and let's have a little bit more substance to these goals other than what's already being done there, and other than the goal of the education program not being there.
Charlie?
I kind of just want to go back to what you were talking about with respect to upland management. This has come up in a couple of others. So I think the DOJ statewide recommend guidance on that is good, but I do want to be really careful because this came up in Fogarty about assuming the intentions of a proposer without having that dialogue. So when I saw that, like in the Fogarty proposal, I really read that as just a description of the site, which is what we were asking for. So we need to be really careful about reading into the intentions of a proposer without that back and forth. And I think we've all recognized that back and forth is a critical part of the process that we're lacking. And so, you know, a future iteration of this process will absolutely depend on that, us rectifying that part of this process. But I do want to be careful about that, just because I kept hearing that in other proposals too. And I'm like, well, I'm not really sure that's what they meant. And I don't think we had the opportunity to talk to them. So that's all I want to, I recognize the overreaching of and that's why I look for a DOJ recommendation across the board, but on intentions per proposal, I just want to be careful about that. I'm often misunderstood, and generally I have often good intentions that go sour because I just want to make that opportunity.
Thank you, Charlie. Andy, where are we at on the list of people?
I am not seeing any hands being raised.
Okay. So are we ready for a vote? Okay, let's move forward and vote on Blacklock Point Marine Conservation Area.
And just as a reminder, please change your chat to all panelists and attendees.
And remember that we're using the 4-vote system that we described yesterday. It's on the chart that's going to come up momentarily. There we go. Okay, so all votes are in. This does move forward with recommendation from the committee. There's only 2 votes, 2 number 4 votes that would stop that recommendation. And just a reminder to everyone that we're doing 80% consensus on this. And so it takes more than 2 votes to stop or to not recommend a project move forward. So let's move to Crook Point, Mack Reef.
Yeah. All righty, last one. Crook Point, Mack Reef Marine Conservation Area. Some similarities to Blacklock in that it's a fairly remote site, very limited access, again, generally by a 1.5 mile walk up the beach. Site use is also very low, consequently. The site itself is a pretty outstanding natural area, which includes an archipelago of offshore rocks, the furthest south one being there, Mack Arch Reef, or Mack Arch Rock. The interest expressed by the proposers, again, seabird nesting success, harbor seal haulouts, habitat protection, and ecosystem-based management. And again, some tribal nations use at the site as well. They're looking to maintain existing site access. I've proposed no changes to harvest regulations. Again, They seek to coordinate with agencies to establish, again, the educational outreach stewardship programs in very much the same way with very much the same focus. No additional restrictions either proposed on human use activities. A couple extra points of note. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages a great deal of the upland that's abuts the designation, and it's currently closed to the public with no intentions to open up access there. The Mack Arch Rock is popular for boaters to some level, and there is a nearshore rockfish commercial fishery at some low level around the reef, but again, no changes to harvest proposed here. Summary from agency analysis, the landward boundary, again, and the request to evaluate at statutory vegetation line. So that landward boundary would have to be reconciled with the Pistol River State Park and potentially U.S. Fish and Wildlife Refuge land there as well. U.S. Fish and Wildlife National Wildlife Refuge land is highly sensitive, cannot sustain additional impacts from increasing site use. Monitoring aspects, again, ambitious, but could potentially be beneficial to agencies and others. The proposed upland management goals, once more, potentially outside the scope of the strategy, although we're waiting for additional clarification on that. Agency support for the volunteer programs, again, would need to be clarified. Capacity in this area is also quite limited. Many enforcement challenges, somewhat similar to Blacklock Point. Site access is difficult. Access to some of the rocky intertidal habitat is also hazardous and difficult. So it presents many enforcement challenges. There's also not necessarily a good sizable community nearby that could potentially support enforcement activities or have a pool of volunteers for the volunteer programs. This site also lacks proper infrastructure to facilitate some of the proposed stewardship activities potentially. Working group observations, it's an outstanding natural area, ecologically important, very deserving of protection. The Memorandum of Understanding or Friends Group agreement with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or other entities is a good idea. Pistol River community input seemed absent from the outreach, and so the working group was curious about that. Concerned that the designation will increase attention and thus site visitation and human impacts, and the question of whether or not this is really counter to the site goals. Access to the site is highly sensitive, so and very erosive to even minimal human impact, so there was concern expressed among the working group about that. Concerns that the goals won't be met and future regulatory changes would need to be made in order to help the site goals align more closely with what's happening at the site. Educational program also not yet fully established, and so funding and support and how that would get off the ground would really need to be identified. Any additional clarifications or context there?
Dave Fox.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe add some clarification to the in the working group observation, that second to last bullet about future regulatory changes. So this site, you know, when you look at it on a map, it's a big polygon that's mostly in you know, subtidal areas that are, you know, pretty well, you know, and that's not a heavy use site, but it's pretty well used by, you know, commercial fishery. Yeah, maybe a little bit of recreational fishery as well. And it's really a matter of perception. So there's no, you know, there's no regulations proposed. So you know, there's no effect on those activities. But when people see that polygon out in the water like that, it's going to look like a marine reserve. And so there's going to be a perception that it's a proposal for a big marine reserve. And even though that's not the case, because, you know, the proposer doesn't do that, I'm sure there'll be, you know, a significant amount of the public that will have the perception that, well, there might not be any regulations today, But once this place is, this site is in place for a couple years, someone is going to come back and propose, fishing restrictions or something like that on the site. So again, it's all perception. That's not in the proposal, but that was, a lot of where that concern rose from.
Thanks, Dave. I have Walter, Chuck, and then Carrie.
Yeah, I just kind of mirror what Dave said, but also the fact that most of the southern part of that boundary that stretches out in the ocean, those rocks are already under Fish and Wildlife Service jurisdiction. And, can I ask Sean to basically put in there what that protection's already in place for those areas that are in that polygon?
Sean, do you want to reply to that?
Sure. So those islands are not accessible to the public. They are a designated wilderness area. And we, again, try to recommend the 2,000-foot half-mile lateral distance during the seabird nesting season to aircraft. And then the Saddle Rock, which is right there at the point, and I think I've mentioned this before, it's accessible at low tide. And so you can walk right out to the island and without getting wet if it's a low enough tide, which is very concerning to Fish and Wildlife Service because, as we've noticed in other areas along the coast, if an island is accessible where people can walk out to it, people will walk out to it and climb on the island because it's a lot of fun. And we don't have the capability of enforcing, the no climb, no access regulation because we have one law enforcement officer half-time dedicated to the entire Oregon coast. That answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Sean.
Carrie.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about the education metrics in relation to, the programs are not established, and I know this came up with a couple of the proposals, is we talk a lot about behavior change and how we want guests to behave, visitors to behave, and what they want them to do and not do, but all of the metrics are numbers, number of programs delivered and number of visitors. There's no metrics that focus on the intentions of the goals, which is to see a change in how visitors are behaving. And again, this isn't the only proposal that's come up in, and I know we've talked about what do we need to be looking at sort of coast-wide, but it goes along with sort of that note about the education programs not being established yet.
Walter, is that a new hand or was that from before? Okay. And Charlie.
Just being a visitor of the site, I wanted to speak to the, impeccable natural area that it is. It is quite fragile. It is quite spectacular. And it does present me with that same paradox that I mentioned before, which is how do we protect our wild spaces that we really love and we want to use that aren't maybe being impacted today, but we know they're likely to be impacted in the future. And how do we do that? So it's a paradox, and it's a difficult space for me to try and understand how we do management around that. But every single one of these sites makes me think, or often these sites make me think about that. And this is one of those just spectacularly wild areas of the Oregon coast.
Thank you, Charlie.
Dick.
Yeah, thanks. Just in somewhat to echo Charlie's recognition of the outstanding natural area capabilities and possibilities here, and just again to note that this site sits essentially as a stepping stone between other protected areas along the south coast, which is well known for having terrific rocky intertidal habitats. But this site sits essentially in the middle of some areas, so it provides great connectivity for larval dispersal and such from the extreme south coast all the way up to the next essential protected area is going to be pretty much at Redfish Rocks Marine Reserve. This site was, of course, recommended as a marine reserve back at that process in 2008 or so, 2009. Didn't make it through the process, but it was, I think the recognition was that it had high value, still has high value, of course, and it does have some of the most extensive rocky intertidal for sticking out from a point down there in the south coast is really spectacular, and thus importance. That being said, as has been noted, even though we're not dealing with the uplands, I think any additional use, these uplands, which are on Fish and Wildlife Service land, are extremely sensitive. They're very, very shallow soiled. Any sorts of additional access to that would slide those into the ocean and really cause great loss, which would be super unfortunate. So I'm like Charlie, quite torn about this site in terms of how to protect it. Almost wonder if the designation is maybe, if we would think about it as a research area as opposed to a marine conservation area. So there's not a good answer for these things in terms of these, how to go about these. And I guess one last point that kind of really sets this site aside in my mind too, is that the uplands and some of the access, other than the access coming down the beach, but a lot of the access is over private lands. And I'm a great proponent of the rights of private landowners. And I just am really concerned that they're just recognizing the possibility, if we put locations on maps that are of, designating a public area, that this could draw people across public land or across private lands, excuse me, that could have, of course, implications. I mean, some of these lands are Fish and Wildlife Service, but their access is also closed to the public. But I do have concerns that we would be, in some ways, it could encourage people to trespass on private lands, which I really don't want us to be getting involved in, and just recognizing the problems that can cause. So this is a tough call for an area that's incredibly important ecologically and sensitive at the same time.
Thank you, Dick.
Dave Lacey.
Not going to reiterate all these great points that people have made about how special the place is and how difficult it would be to do an education program there. But just wanted to throw a side note out there that I just recently saw an Instagram post from a prominent shoe company in Oregon of somebody standing up on the headland, looking down at Mack Reef, saying how special this place is. And we asked them to take that post down because it's such a special place, and we knew they were trespassing. So people are coming into that area from the beach to the north. And if we could do anything, we could make a recommendation with Fish and Wildlife. Maybe we could help. I'm just going to offer up, we should help put some new signage up there, because maybe it blew away. There used to be a lot of signs there that might help educate people to not go up on that headland, but that just happened last week. So people are trespassing there, unfortunately.
Thanks, Dave. Walter. You're still on mute.
Yeah, I had asked Sean's comments to be added as a bullet point.
Okay.
A bullet point on the next slide.
As part of the working group observation.
Okay, Sean, can you re-summarize your point for me?
Well, my main point was, and Sean can put on there, was that much of the southern boundary is already in the National Wildlife Refuge, and then Sean can explain what protections are already in place there.
Yeah, but the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge is designated a wilderness area, and wilderness area restricts human disturbance, human presence. Also, another note, so I had stated in the past that the islands are not accessible or open to the public, but the Crook Point Headland is also U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service property, and that is also closed to the public. And I just wanted to reiterate the fragileness of the area. I don't know if fragileness is a word, but other folks have said that it's very fragile, and it is. And it cannot withstand traffic, human traffic or vehicles or anything like that.
Thank you, Sean.
Dave Fox.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of make 2 points, somewhat responding to some of the earlier discussion, but maybe a new point as well. So the proposal includes area, a small area north of the headland as well. And I think we all know, it's very difficult to access south of the headland. There probably isn't a huge amount of visitation, in the area south of the headland, but north of the headland is pretty easy to get to, just to walk down the beach. And I believe that Solid Rock is accessible, at low tide from people coming from there. So to get to, the offshore rock that's climbable or accessible, you don't have to, kind of brave the difficult access into the south part of the headland. You get there from the north. So I could see benefits of educational, stewardship type folks, kind of stationed in that area to help with that. And that would also, I don't know if you could climb the headland from the north side or not, but if you can, it could help also alleviate that. So I see some value there if education program can be maintained. That's another discussion. But if it can, then there's value there. The second point is, if it, and again, there's another if here. If a monitoring program, whether it be volunteer or whatever, could be maintained there, that would be a lot of value as well. It's here I'm talking about the intertidal area on the south side of the headland. It's a area that hasn't had a lot of research done at it or monitoring, so it would be kind of filling a gap along the Oregon coast in that. And I want to caveat that with, as long as it's feasible to get monitoring crew in and out of there safely, without getting on the headland, those types of things. That would have some value as well.
Thanks, Dave. Scott?
Yeah, I'd point out that this site does have communities nearby. Bristol River, Gold Beach isn't that far, so there is some pool potential volunteers to help monitor and prevent the problems associated with people coming from the north down and a fairly easy access.
Thank you, Scott. Other comments? Anybody in the queue, Andy?
Do not see anyone in the queue.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, Charlie popped his hand up.
This is just one question I have, and I don't want to rabbit hole. So facilitator, you can tell me this is no good if not. But this kind of goes to Dave Fox's comment about the way the polygon feels, and I don't disagree. With respect to marine reserve stuff, but what I ask myself is, well, doesn't any polygon that does area-based management in the ocean, couldn't you say that about it? And so what's unique about this particular site with respect to that comment? And I think it's the community that's adjacent that area, but I just wanted a little bit more specificity from Dave, if he felt that way for other sites. And I suspect there's other, because I suspect there's other individuals that may react to many sites that way. And so I want to understand maybe some root behind that feeling. And maybe it was that it was a marine reserve designation before, but
Proposal.
Dave, speak to that.
So maybe under the next slide, we could put a recommendation that they clarify or justify the need for that size of a polygon. Would that address your issues, Charlie?
I think my question was for Dave, actually. Yeah, Dave Fox had made the comment about that. And I know Dave Lacey was close to the proposal that was happening down there at the time too. So maybe he has a comment about it as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's go with Dave Fox and then Dave Lacey, since you both have your hands up.
Yeah, Charlie, yeah, to respond to that, I mean, these are some discussions we had throughout this process of, we didn't want this process to be proposing marine reserves, right? And that's all related to the fact that there was a kind of a promise made that there would be no new marine reserves until the legislature completed the evaluation of the Marine Reserve Program in 2020. So we didn't want to have this proposal kind of get crosswise, with that promise, or this whole process get crosswise with that promise about no new marine reserves. And as we went through this process, we started out with a working group recommendation that all these sites be intertidal only. And that was a solid working group recommendation. That recommendation went to OPAC, and OPAC voted against it and decided that the proposals could be intertidal and subtidal. And the reasoning there was that, we believe that there already are a bunch of intertidal sites that have protections. Marine reserves are primarily subtidal sites, and most people don't conflate intertidal site protections with marine reserves. So we started out, we thought they would be intertidal only. That got changed. So we had further discussions to say, okay, what would it take to have a proposal include intertidal and subtidal and not be considered a marine reserve because of the subtidal area included. And we couldn't really come up with a hard and fast absolute definition, like there's a hard line between either it's a marine reserve or not. But in general, I think we felt, maybe it's just me, but I think this got reflected in the strategy. We felt that if the area of subtidal is primarily close to shore and pretty shallow water, we use 5 meter depth as kind of a landmark or a benchmark, but that's not absolute. Close to shore and pretty shallow water, that it would be just considered kind of a ecologically contiguous area with that rocky intertidal, and it wouldn't be considered a marine reserve. And part of that is also related to the fact that most boats that would be fishing would not be working in that water anyway, because of the proximity to shore. So that's kind of how we expressed it in the strategy. But we left it open that proposers could propose anything they want. But if they propose something that looked like a marine reserve, there may be some issues. So to me, the areas that look like marine reserves are the areas that have substantial amount of subtidal habitat, that has areas that are, very accessible by boats, that are distant from shore and are in deeper water. And the ones that we mentioned, during the review that came up for that were things like the Seal Rock proposal, the Otter Rock proposal, and then this one. And I think some others might have mentioned that in some of the other proposals as well.
Yeah. Okay.
But that's kind of a long answer to your question.
It sounds like the short answer is the extent of subtitle that's included in the proposal.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to be clear for somebody who may be proposing, who may not know what a polygon looks like that doesn't look like a marine reserve or does look like a marine reserve. So the reason I'm asking for this clarity is because not that I don't feel the same way in many cases, but I don't know that we give good direction to the public about that. And I want to make sure that we are giving good direction to the public about, so we're not just doing this bring me another rock kind of thing, and that we're clear about what does and doesn't look like a type of designation.
Dave, I think that background helped to provide good additional context.
It was
So,
helpful.
so thank you. Dave Lacey and then Walter.
Yeah, I think a suggestion I would like us to consider adding as a bullet here is if this polygon was vastly reduced to incorporate the area around Crook Point and Saddle Rock, all the places you could get to even at the lowest tides of the year. And then it was mentioned that access would only come in, from the north at Lola Lake or Pistol River Wayside for the volunteer and stewardship programs. Then I think this would have a lot better chance of success, because I think that perception of the Marine Reserve might be real. So if we're willing to add another bullet, I think this would be a lot more palatable for a lot of people.
Thank you, Dave.
Dave, could you just expand on those changes one more time so Moses could maybe think about trying to capture them?
Yeah, if we're just reducing the polygon to the areas you could get to at the lowest tide, so around Crook Point and Saddle Rock, just the big tip there. And then specify that the access for these programs would come in not through the refuge, but through public beach access and a trail that actually brings you really close to the refuge. It's called Lola Lake. It's a really beautiful little trail that takes you down there. So I guess access from the north and a smaller polygon. Thank you.
Thank you. Walter?
Yeah, it's kind of the concern about the Marine Reserve perception. I think it has more to do with the designation they chose to put here, and the possibility for further restrictions. If it was smaller and included what Dave was talking about and was a marine research area or a marine garden, I think it would be much less concern, and it would be a lot easier for those concerns to be put aside.
Carrie?
In thinking about the previous proposal and then thinking about what Walter just said, this is still, in terms of regulations, harvest regulations is still status quo. So we still run into the same question that we did with the last proposal. And if the proposers were willing to think about education area or research area, those harvest regulations change. So it just needs to be noted that that is something that needs to be considered beyond status quo.
Thank you, Carrie.
Sean Stevenson.
Just wanted to make a note that accessing the area from the north can be difficult. That point at Crook Point that sticks out there has large boulders that are along the beach and that extend into the water. And possibly the only time that you could walk around that point is at low tide, and it would be difficult to do even then because of the obstacles.
Thank you. Walter, is this a new hand or same one from before?
Okay, anybody else in the queue? Andy?
Oh, Laurel?
I just wanted to sort of piggyback on what Sean said about the access. If one of the recommendations is that folks access the beach from the north, they're not going to be able to access the entirety of the site except at significant low tide. Is that correct, Sean? And then
Yeah,
there would be safety concerns associated with if the tide came, you know, as far as them being able to get back if they came at low tide, that would just be a factor of making sure they don't trespass because of safety concerns.
yeah, and I hate to say this, but it would be so easy to walk over the headland on refuge property rather than trying to walk around those big boulders and possibly, you know, like you said, if the tide comes in and it's high tide when they're trying, people are trying to evacuate the area, they may be left with that's their only option is to walk over refuge property over that fragile headland.
So any other comments, Andy? Any people in the queue?
Nobody in the queue.
Okay. Awesome. So let's vote on Crook Point Mack Reef. Okay. This area, Crook Point Mack Reef, has 3 do not recommend votes, so it does not pass as a recommendation by this group. So that's it. We made it through all 12 proposals. Great job, everyone. Thanks for staying focused and engaged in this program.
Laurel has her hand up.
Yeah.
Can we?
Oh, I was just gonna ask whether maybe we could do a summary for the folks that might not have been here yesterday about what, when you say it moves forward with recommendations, there's a lot of, you know, but to that. I mean,
Yeah,
it's not that it has a lot of work has to happen for a lot of these proposals. I don't know that everybody that was on the, I mean, that everybody that's here today was here yesterday and fully understands what that means. So I think it would be valuable to explain it because it's not very clear cut.
Yeah, we've planned that as part of this process, and that's what the next slide really is all about. Before we go there, I'd just like to review kind of what we came up with and talk about it, see if it sounds reasonable to everyone. Just to review the voting and the way we chose to vote for this. If you look at the averages at the end, it kind of gives you an idea of what the ranking of each proposal is. So the one that got the best votes is the one with the lowest average. And that for this group is the Coquille Point Marine Garden, got a 1.6. Followed by the ones in the 2s, Cape Blanco Marine Research Area, the Ecola Point Marine Conservation Area, and Chapman Point Marine Conservation Area. From there, we jump into the ones with the 3s. We only had, I want to note that we only had one proposal that was in the 3 average that actually was recommended by this group by the vote. And that is the Blacklock Point Marine Conservation Area was 3.2, but only had 2 don't recommend votes. So that's the only one. All the other ones that are in the 3s or beyond failed the recommendation of this group, or were not recommended by the group. So does that sound reasonable to everyone? It looks like the voting system worked adequately to provide the kind of feedback that we needed for these proposals, and it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4 proposals were recommended by this group. 5 actually proposals were recommended by this group. So comments?
I saw Laurel's and Andrew's hands.
Yeah, I think we might need a little bit more discussion about the 3 category, because we voted 3 on a lot of them because there's a lot of modifications that would need to be made to be able to recommend it from our agency. So I think that just requires further discussion, and I think it's important for the folks to know that there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done, and there's still reservations even if those conditions are met for some of these sites.
That's a good comment. Thank you, Laura.
Andrea?
Yeah, to that point a little bit. And just to clarify, because there are probably definitely different people on the line today and yesterday, and I'm, at least this morning, I did a lot of thinking about this last night and this morning. Frank, you keep saying recommended, and I'm getting really hung up on, like, even still, the 1, 2, 3 is all recommended, and I don't want to rehash the voting system that we agreed to, but I think that it's important, at least for me, in terms of the way that I voted, that this was like not an end all be all, and that it doesn't speak to the merit of the proposals. And I'm really hoping that on a number of them, we can get additional information during the public comment period. And the way that I understand this process is that because there wasn't that iterative process, that there is opportunity during the public comment period for us to get additional information to help resolve some of those issues. And that before we actually make a recommendation and have final recommendations to OPAC, that we are going to have another conversation about this. So I want to be really clear about the intentions. And I think that the terms recommended and not recommended keep getting used a lot. And maybe I'm the only one that may have taken some things out of context or had confusion yesterday. But yeah, I really want that as a point of process, that we can have some additional conversation about the next steps and how proposers might be able to interact and get us additional information, and how that can be an iterative process.
Yeah, thank you for that, Andrea. And we have time scheduled in this meeting for that. That's the next slide that comes up to talk about that, and what our next steps are, how this does move forward from there. And then we have time to talk about the general aspects of voting and the whole process in general as well. So thank you for those comments. And I think we can address those comments in further discussions that we're going to have as a committee.
Yeah, Moses, let's go ahead to that next slide, because I think that we do need to talk about our view of what comes next. I don't think this is the one I was thinking of.
This is the order we planned, but we can jump around if you'd like.
Yeah, let's go to the what's next slide.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There you go.
So Andy or Moses, do you want to lead the discussion on this?
Sure, I'll go for it and then open it up to group discussion here. So, you know, obviously we've had a lot of conversation about these words and terms and what does the recommendation mean and what does it look like for this process and how is it going to work for this process. So we just thought we would revisit some of that here so that we all are hopefully on the same page with it by the time we're done here. So what does an initial recommendation mean? And so that key word there that I want to remind everybody is initials. So these are not final recommendations. These are our initial recommendations. It's a matter of can we, with the considerations that have been outlined here today, balance that with the merits of a proposal, as well as the feedback that we would like to hear from the public, especially those who worked on these proposals. So not only that, but the voting system that we're using here really is a representation of not necessarily a binary recommend, do not recommend kind of vote. It's more a representation of the comfort level of each individual member of the working group with a particular proposal moving forward for a potential recommendation, given that list of considerations. So of course, these are going to go out for public comment and we're going to wait for the comment to come back. And so part of this conversation includes how will that public comment necessarily be considered by the working group. So just a couple of points of conversation to note here is all submitted public comments will be reviewed and presented to the working group for consideration. Proposers, again, are invited to communicate their clarifications based on these initial recommendations and their willingness to accommodate the conditions provided here. And also lastly, I just want to point out to everyone that we're not asking for proposal revisions from our proposers, just comments on the conditions that we've outlined here for any such potential recommendation. And then, of course, following all of the digestion of that public feedback, the working group will take a second vote again for their final recommendations. So that will be when we determine which ones we are forwarding for potential consideration by OPAC. So that will be later in this process in April.
Charlie, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate that at the end of this, I feel like there's been some concern, particularly from state agencies who want to remain very objective and are capacity limited, but about accountability for the vote, you know, and what are you actually saying as a state agency about one proposal or another, or an individual working group member? And what we are here to do is to collectively arrive at a recommendation. So our recommendation is a group recommendation, and it doesn't bear on any individual of the group. It bears on the collective of the group. And so I know that there's been a lot of concern, particularly from our state agencies, about, you know, what they can support and what they can't support. But at the end of the day, that's part of the joint effort here. So we're really making a group recommendation. And I just want to reiterate that because I know that this has constantly been a concern throughout the evaluation period of some of the participants.
Scott McMullen.
Thank you, Andy. From my perspective, I would like for those proposals that predominantly got 3s but weren't rejected, they had that didn't have more than 4 votes, number 4 votes, that they, while they're going forward, I would appreciate if we didn't use the word recommendation on those. I don't see that as a recommendation. You look at the voting key that we had, it said reservations even with conditions. And that, to me, that isn't, I didn't vote a 3 because I was recommending it. I voted because I had reservations, even with the conditions. So from my perspective, I think the terminology we use should not be a recommendation for everything that goes forward, but we have recommendations and recommendations with conditions. And then we have also some others that we have reservations about and not imply that that's a recommendation.
Okay, so I saw a bunch of hands go up in a row here. So Dave Fox, then Tom, then I think Moses, and then Andrea. And so let's hit that order.
Yeah, thanks. All right, thanks. I just wanted to ask a question that I asked yesterday and got two different answers. And so I want to ask it again. So can proposers that got 3 or more 4 votes in this process, are they invited to communicate their clarifications, with the conditions and such that we listed and based on, all the discussion? And will we consider those a second time?
I believe that it is our responsibility, because these are just initial recommendations, that if a proposer wants to, even if they ended up in the do not recommend category at this time around, if they wanted to comment to us, we should be open to receiving those comments. And I believe that it is up to each individual representative of this group to take whatever new information that we have regarding each proposal and have an opportunity to weigh in on that proposal in the next go round. That's my perspective, in my opinion.
Okay, so just to clarify, then all the proposals have, for lack of a better word, have a second chance, basically.
Yes, and Laurel just asked about my terminology of the next go round. When we come back together as a working group after receiving public comment, that time that we come together and we review all the comments and we actually repeat this process in a vote, that is what I'm referring to. That is the creation of our final recommendation that will go to the Ocean Policy Advisory Council. So Tom, and then Moses, and then Andrew, I think.
Yeah, this is just a bit of a clarifying question. I want to make sure I understand what we are saying. In those second and third bullets, we're saying we're inviting proposers to communicate their clarifications, etc., but we are not asking for proposal revisions. And I just want to make sure I understand what that means. So does that mean that the proposals we have they're not going to be revised? We're going to receive comments, clarifications and remarks about willingness to accommodate the conditions that have been provided, but not going to consider revisions to the proposal. So I'm just trying to unpack that a little bit, make sure I understand how that's going to play out. It's difficult for me to understand if someone says, I want to clarify that I can accommodate these conditions, and that in many cases, those conditions do have, in fact, they will revise the proposal. So I want to just make sure I understand how's that going to work if they say, yep, I can accept those conditions, and the effect of that will be to revise the proposal, but we're not asking them to revise the proposal. Sorry, it's just logic puzzle.
Yeah, thank you. The proposal would carry with it the modifications, the clarifications, and it would become our recommendation as a working group that totality of what's left will be the recommendation that moves forward to OPAC. So
sorry, go ahead.
Moses, do you want to try? Maybe I didn't explain that well.
Yeah, no, I was going to respond to what Scott and Dave Fox both were saying, and a little bit to what Tom's saying, just process stuff. Since we're on this, Tom, here's what I think about. Imagine the most perfect proposal comes in. We all love it. It's great. Gets ones across the board. But there's a provision in it that says, oh, and by the way, me, the proposer, gets free food at Local Ocean for the rest of my life. We would probably recommend that OPAC adopt this amazing, perfect proposal, but that one provision about free food at Local Ocean, let's not implement that part. So we're really doing the exact same thing here with a lot of these. We're saying merit-wise, there's a lot of great stuff in these proposals. However, a few of these provisions just don't really fit the process or don't really fit the management landscape or some other implementation or feasibility issue. And so that's what we're calling out, is those things. And so in the final recommendations for those that move to OPAC for consideration, we're saying we recommend implementation of this site proposal with the following considerations, that if it were to be implemented, we would only support it if these following considerations were directly addressed or not implemented. So that's what we're saying. And to more broadly to what Scott and Dave were wondering about, this is partly why and where we got off track a little bit yesterday with, I think there's different conceptions out there of what a recommendation means or what a consideration or a qualification means. But at the end of the day, we're making 12 recommendations. We have 12 proposals. Every single one of them is getting a recommendation. Whether that recommendation is do not implement or do not consider for potential recommendation to the commission is a different kind of recommendation than we're saying, yes, please consider recommending this to the commission, but under the following conditions. But it's a recommendation nonetheless. So we're going to prepare 12 recommendations and have them reviewed by the working group. And then we'll make final decisions based on public feedback, our comfort level for submitting recommendations in the positive to the council, given the conditions and the feedback we've received. Does that help clarify for everyone? Or did I just go way off base? I see Scott shaking his head.
Yeah, so let's go with Tom. Let's try and make sure that Tom, you had your question answered.
I'll just wrap up my thinking by referencing back to something Carrie said yesterday that kind of resonated with me, I guess, because I'm a scientific writer type. And we talked about, has merit needs work or reviewer comments or revisions. So that's why I asked the question I asked, because to me, it sounds like a process of revision, whatever we end up calling it. It sounds like some sort of opening some kind of dialogue between proposers and deciders that gets us to a point of agreement about what's going forward, or maybe not agreement, but at least clarity, right? And so I appreciate, because I've always felt like we would end up here, and here we are, because you have to have some kind of interaction between the people who are presenting their ideas and the people who are trying to interpret those ideas, and then the people who are going to make decisions about those ideas. So I get that we're trying to find our way through that process. I'm cool with that. I'm happy to go along for the ride. Hopefully everyone else will, and we'll figure out a way to do it. I do have some other questions about how that's going to work, but I'll hold off on that and we could continue the conversation.
I guess I'll just finish by saying, as far as proposal revision, in my mind, a proposal revision is asking the proposer to do that work. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're saying we're submitting our recommendations with those interpreted qualifications for potential recommendation, rather than asking the proposer to do additional work. And this was actually a decision that we made in our fall meetings to not be in the business of revising proposals as they stand. But as far as what we may or may not recommend is slightly different.
Got it.
Okay, so let's go Andrea, Scott, and then Carrie.
Actually, can you come back to me after Scott and Carrie? I think I
Sure.
just had a new thought and want to like
Yep.
fully. Yep. Thank you.
So Scott.
Yeah, two things. One, with regard to having the proposers modify the proposal, bring it back during the public comment period, this seems to me unfair to the public. We're presenting a public comment period for the proposals as they are now. That is what the public has a chance to weigh in on, not something that may come later. How is there a public comment for the proposal as it will be modified? So, I mean, we've got 7 months until the next round of proposals can be submitted. And in the scheme of things, that isn't a long time. I think it's a poor direction for us to go, to say to proposers, we'll go ahead and work on them and we'll work it in, we'll get it in there. But meanwhile, the public only has one thing to look at, and that is the proposals that have been presented to us that we've looked at. And the second point has to do with this wording again. And Moses, I appreciate you trying, and I understand what you're saying, but you know, when I looked at I took a snapshot of the spreadsheet, and it says recommend with conditions, reservations, even with conditions, and then do not recommend. But then you're saying, well, they're all recommendations, might be a recommendation to not recommend. That kind of reminds me of George Orwell and doublespeak. And let's make a very clear and understandable statement to OPAC when we put this forward. Say these are the ones that we recommend. These are some other ones that we had reservations with, and then these are the ones that did not that we are not recommending, that we did not recommend, do not recommend. So I think we need to be clear with the public and clear to OPAC and what we've done. Thank you.
Carrie, Walter. I think I saw then Charlie and Andrea again.
Thanks. I think Moses, I think your explanation about recommendations in terms of how we're handling each proposal clarified things more for me. But and I think that this is actually a point somebody else made earlier or yesterday, is the conditions that we made for a number of these proposals actually has the potential to significantly impact the goals of the proposals. And even if they're saying, yes, I'm willing to live with these conditions and move forward with them, then we are left interpreting what the goals of the proposal are without a lot of clarity, I guess, is, you know, there's, I'm trying to think of a good one, but, you know, they're talking about what their metrics are and how they're going to measure things, which are tied to the goals, but those goals are tied to the things they recommended. And now we're asking if we can change those things. So it's kind of a domino effect. And I know that you guys are working really, really hard to keep all of us ducks lined in a row and heading towards an end goal here, but it's just really, really muddy. And I think without getting something in writing from the proposers that at least considers how these impacts are how these changes are impacting their goals, I don't know that we can actually make an informed decision the second time around. I'm not trying to make your lives more difficult. I'm just putting that out there as a caveat. I get that this is not an easy process, but you know, we're some of these are pretty substantive, and they can definitely change the intent of the proposal completely, and we don't have enough information then in some ways to say yay or nay, unless I'm not understanding the process. So anyway, thank you.
I think Walter, you were next.
All right, so my first question is, at the next iteration, are we going to rescore these based on public comment?
I believe we would have everyone who's a part of the working group be able to consider new information that comes from public comment and have a discussion about with everyone about, does that change it? Would the group want to change between our initial recommendation and what we are going to recommend to OPAC? Like, I'm hearing Scott say that there's a desire to have 3 buckets next time as we consider these sites. I heard, recommend, has merit, needs work, or do not recommend.
Okay. Like I said, I'm not going to get into what's going to happen at OPAC just because of my position, Andy. But my question is about the rescoring. So if we're going, some of these ones that got 2s and 3s, if those conditions, if we're not asking for revisions, and then they don't revise them, those conditions won't be met. Correct?
That's correct. And we will have the chance to change our vote on those sites as whatever information is available to us to consider them.
So basically, we will be rescoring them then, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so, and this is just to be completely transparent, that we're not asking for revisions, and if these proposers don't meet those revisions, their 2s could become 4s, or their 4s could become 1s, correct?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make that clear because I don't want to have this come back and
these are our draft recommendations. In some ways, it's us being able to provide constructive criticism based upon the issues that we identified, some of which I think were clearly problematic, and others of which were more of a general suggestion. But it is up to the proposers to clarify intent if that needs to be clarified, or to recognize what's heard through our recommendation and provide guidance on how they feel about those, to inform us when we come back together and look at them again.
okay, and back to, just to reiterate what Carrie said, that if these proposals the proposers do take our recommendations and take out many of the things that we had conditions on, that it would basically strip their proposals to basically status quo. And that might also affect their scoring on that criteria, correct?
It may.
Okay, I just want to make sure that's clear for everybody, and so we don't have surprises. I don't want to try and get my magic 8-ball out and predict the future, but I just want to be very, very clear on it, and I appreciate it. Thanks, Andy.
Yeah. Okay, so I think Andrea, Charlie, and then Scott, and then Dick.
Actually, I will take down my hand. Andy, that was a very clear statement, and I feel like I actually know what the next steps in the process are and like what it looks like on the other side in terms of all of the different scenarios. I guess my only real clarifying question was between, I forget who said what, and then what Walter just said. And if the buckets are the 3 that we had talked about many months ago in the working group in terms of recommends, has merit, needs work, and don't recommend, or if we are going to continue to use this numbering system in terms of making, and you don't have to answer right now, but some clarity so that I can think about it when I'm considering changes and things about how, so I can be prepared to, I guess, I don't know. Anyway, but thank you for that clarification. And yeah, I will take my hand down.
Charlie?
Well, this is the first time I feel pretty lost. I guess maybe I need a recap of that. But I guess I wouldn't mind just a quick recap, Andy, of what you communicated, because I feel like we wandered a little bit there in that discussion, so that there's some clarity here. And then also just, I feel like we've gotten hung up on the vote numbers, which were votes. They were individual votes. They weren't the recommendation, right? They were your individual votes, and collectively they result in something that is a indicator that should be some information for OPAC. But I guess I don't feel like an individual vote is that binary right now, that we're still trying to understand and explore them. But it does get to a binary point. And so so I'm just trying to fully understand that, and just recapping that would be very helpful.
All right, well, let me give this a whirl. I think we as a working group have as our intention to evaluate the ideas that have been brought to us, to have some iteration between what agencies observed and analyzed from our capacity and from the observations that have been brought forward from our working group. So we created a summary of that kind of universe of thought around each proposal that was brought forward to us. I believe the exercise that we just went through provided some qualitative guidance in a quantitative way to basically how close or how far each individual idea was, like the level of merit and the potential universe of concerns in relation to that merit. We have, out of the last 2 days, come up with kind of a high level initial recommendation about our group's comfort with those sites, but those sites associated with that list of potential concerns. Moses and I will be producing for each of these proposals a summary page that's maybe 2 pages long that includes kind of how the proposal scored given those the ranking kind of systems. And that will be a part of what the public will respond to in public comment. We will receive that feedback, I would hope, from our proposers, whether or not they agree with or take issue with any of the potential considerations that we as a group have identified, and give us a sense of their level of comfort with hopefully that proposal as it stands, or that proposal as it was modified by our group, given that universe of considerations. We will take that information in as a summary, a totality of what we have for each of these sites. And once we have that public comment, we will come back and discuss them. I believe that we should focus on the areas where we had most consensus. There were some sites that I think there was a lot of consensus around the fact that it didn't fit within our conceptual framework, or it was incomplete and did not then receive a full analysis of the potential, basically value of implementing that sites. I think we will have a range of proposals that fall within comfort. And I think those two classes that Scott mentioned, has merit, needs work, but, or recommends, I think may fall out of that discussion once we have that totality of information back from our public comment. And we will, as a group, decide on each of those sites whether or not they warrant a recommendation to OPAC in the next process step where we come back together, review what we've heard, and apply them to what we know. Moses, I'll give you a chance. Did I capture that accurately? Did I miss something?
No, that sounded great to me. And the thought I have is, if anyone's still struggling with this process, ask yourself, why is it that we set up in this process an initial recommendation and a final recommendation, if not to allow space for what we're discussing here today?
Thanks for the walking through that. I feel like I understand it as far as it leaving our hands and going to OPAC, but I'm just trying to envision how OPAC will handle it as well. And I'm still thinking through that, just with conditions and changes and things like that. I know it gets complicated, so.
Scott and Dick, you have your hands raised still.
Yeah, thank you. So to me, a problem here is what we send forward to OPAC is proposals that have been modified that have not had agency review. We heard repeatedly yesterday that one of the issues is their agency hasn't been able to look at what would be changed. So I think it's a wrong direction to go, to push something forward that's been modified without giving everybody a chance to see it. That all of us, agency people, all of us will have a meeting like we've had today and yesterday. Presumably, we'll do this all again at the end of the 30-day public comment period. Only we'll have new proposals, so we'll have to kind of go through what the changes were. We don't probably have to do everything, but the only agency review will be the shot we get in the Zoom meeting at the end of public comment. So I just think that is the wrong direction, the wrong way to create a policy. We have some that can go forward now, and we have some that I think can be worked on and resubmitted in October. But I'd like to make a motion, probably will die, but I'll make a motion that we not allow modifications to the proposals that would substantively change the proposals without agency review. And I have to get off. I have I'm late. So.
Okay. Well, from a process standpoint, a motion is on the floor. So is there a second to that motion?
I'm sorry, I got distracted right when that was being made. Can we repeat that? I'm sorry.
Sure. Scott?
Well, the motion is that given that agencies will not have a chance to review the modifications to the proposals, nor will we, other than whatever we learn at a meeting a month from a month from now at the end of the public comment period, the only analysis will be what we can kind of absorb in a meeting like this at the end of the public comment period. So I don't think that's adequate to make decisions that are, really substantive changes. The analysis that the state has done has been on the proposals as they are submitted, not as the agencies didn't do any analysis saying, well, if they change these things, then this would be the result. So that will all be new stuff. And to suggest that we should send something forward to OPAC that doesn't have that level of review, why did we even have agency review? We should have waited until we received changes and then started the agency review. So my proposal is just that those proposals that don't go forward would be just given the opportunity to resubmit in October when the next round goes through.
So let me just, because I don't feel like I can speak for other agencies, but I feel like I can speak for DLCD, and that as a part of our exercise, we called out the most problematic aspects of the proposals, and we identified those as conditions to be further worked on, to be, kind of removed from their proposals. So I'd like to let my other agency counterparts comment as to whether or not they feel like the proposals, given any public comment back from our proposers, would you deem those, analyzed as a proposal from your perspective? Dave, your hand went up, and then.
Sure. I'll start. So I'll try to keep my discussion below 30 minutes here. So it really, it depends on what they say. You're absolutely right, Andy. The conditions that we put on these yesterday and today, many of them resulted from our agency review. We have reviewed, in essence, a proposal, that it could pass. I won't say it will, because to Carrie's point, if they're big enough changes, it might substantially kind of derail the goals and various other measures in the proposal, and that's a judgment we're going to have to make after we receive the public comments. But I could envision proposals where the changes aren't really maybe that many or that big, that our review of those comments, and I don't think the review of the comments is only going to happen in a meeting. I'm hoping we get some time before the meeting to see the written comments and make judgments and on our own. I could envision making a decision, yay or nay, on that proposal with those comments coming in from the proposer. Again, there's a lot of caveats to that. Did they address the provision or the conditions? Is their proposal still valid when they made those changes? Does it as I said earlier, does it derail the whole thing, or are they changes that are still make the proposal valid? I think we could make those judgments, but in my mind, if there's any uncertainty, we're not going to move coming in from the bat. Did they address the provisions? Is their proposal still valid? Does it we got some information back. We analyze this, and we still have questions. And at that point, we make the vote such that they're next in. But I would hate to make a blanket thing that says we won't accept any kind of change because I don't think any of the proposals will go forward if we make that blanket change. And some of them are really close. They only need some minor tweaks. So it'd be nice to, if those changes are made, it'd be nice to see those go forward. And so I think if we make it all black and white, we're gonna kind of put ourselves in a box here, and and kind of pre-make the decision today, basically. And so I don't know. I guess maybe I'll let the other agencies talk and see what they say.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I think I got most of that, but I also think that there was some technological interference that kept me from hearing everything. But I'm going to go to Laurel and then Andrea.
Yeah, I just have some questions about the timeline, and I will have to take things as modified to the staff responsible for managing those areas to some extent. So that's why I asked the question. I've had my hand up for a while about, what's our meeting schedule look like? When will we get materials? Are we going to have time to do that? Because depending on the scale of the changes, I need to get feedback from management. So that's why I asked that question. And so I can't answer without knowing more about next steps, specific, timeline. Do we have enough time for enough meetings to go through this all again? Is that the plan, is to have another round of, are we going to have agency review meetings or just working group meetings? Or how much time in between the now and the public comment period and the OPAC meeting do we have to set aside meetings? We don't have meetings set aside as far as I can tell on my calendar. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I'm getting into the weeds, but those are the types of things I'll need to know so I can know if there's time to get that feedback from park management.
Okay, so understanding timing, crucial issue. I completely understand. We have had some weeks ahead of us outlined for action on our part. I think, Moses and I will be calendaring for that in the near future so that we have those time horizons better understood. Andrea, and then Patty.
Yeah, and granted, there are considerably more caveats to all of the proposals and considerations for parks than for DSL. But I just wanted to highlight that one of my main points on two of the proposals yesterday was just a point of clarification. So it's at least in my head, I wouldn't need to go back and review the entire proposal. I've actually already gotten feedback and had the point clarified from the proposer. So I would already have a better understanding of what the intent was. And I know that we had a lot of conversations about intent and information and the ability to get feedback. But from DSL's perspective, the main issue is with kelp, and it's throughout all of the proposals. So not speaking to the merit or the goals or how any of those changes affect the proposal holistically, but in terms of agency feasibility, actually the two proposals that I had my main concerns with have already been resolved.
Okay, Patty.
Hi, just wanted to say something, and Dave alluded to this too, but that agencies would be getting the public comment, well before the meeting. It wouldn't just hit them there. That really wouldn't be fair to anybody. But and also, I don't think we've talked about this internally, but I wouldn't expect that there'd be agency meetings and working group meetings. I would think there would just be working group meetings because we're, the group would be fine tuning, if you will. Their responses, their recommendations. So anyway, just wanted to say that that the agencies wouldn't be just hit then and looking at those comments for the first time, right, when they were meeting. So thanks.
Okay, Scott, I know you got to go, so let's allow you to speak here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have remembered to take down my hand. My motion didn't get a second, so I'll just say thank you guys very much. Appreciate your time and all the work you've done. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Walter, and then Dick.
Thanks, Andy. I think we've had quite a bit of discussion, but I just want to kind of bring this around. And what was if you can just state again, what was the original purpose of the working group? It was, can you just state it really easy? It was to update part 3 and what else?
Well, it was to allow our public communities to have interaction and input as to ideas to improve the management of our rocky habitats in the state. And they have brought forward ideas for us to consider, doing a lot of work in the process. And we are doing our best to ensure that constructive criticism is provided, that guidance is provided, that we as a whole can look at the merits of their ideas, and in the end, help the state make a recommendation about improvements to that broad management, whether it's site specific or actually holistic in nature. And I still want to, I realize we only have an hour left. There are cross-cutting issues that these proposals have brought forward to us. The big crux being whether or not we want to use the carrot or the stick approach from a management perspective, whether or not we want to implement new rules or whether or not we want to potentially come up with another way to help the state to address those issues. Moses, maybe you could go to that other slide that we prepared, because I think it's important for the group to recognize that it's not only our individual site management designations that are important, although that's what this last couple of days have been completely focused on.
Sorry.
But because we have heard consistently by the folks who've proposed things to us that disturbance to wildlife is an issue. The kind of the human interaction with the environment. I think there's a number of ways that we as a group can work to improve how that happens, or support how the state can work to improve how that happens. And we've heard a lot about volunteer programs, interpreter programs, touch points, right? So just making people aware of the sensitivities at these special places that they may not otherwise be aware of. And I think that there are potential ideas at the state level, and there are potential ideas at the site level. Right now, on the screen, right, we've developed some talking points for what could be involved in a site-focused management plan that actually does have more of the stick approach, or the kind of site-based interpreter programs, which is much more of the carrot approach. And I think we should be talking about that because of what we've heard through the proposals that have been brought in. And because we have provided guidance and kind of conditions where we said we don't think that additional rules are appropriate in some places. So that's really one of the things that I'd like to talk about is kind of the amount of support that an idea might like that might have for this group, and whether or not we should, in addition to making other recommendations regarding part 3, also think about making a recommendation on something like this. Moses, maybe you could help walk through some of the kind of ideas that are on this slide so that we can have a different voice to help to explain that.
Well, I think you did a pretty good job teeing up the ball, though, Andy. As far as particularly characterizing as carrot versus stick. Site-based interpreter programs versus a site-focused management plan. So I think, one of the implications there is if it's all of our eggs are in the site management basket, that necessarily might imply, rules and regulations, and that doesn't always sit well with everyone, and maybe isn't even the most effective way necessarily to always manage a particular issue. And can be hard to do at a landscape scale. So, some of these site-based interpretive programs, they can provide really more localized support for a particular site, more of a bottom-up approach than a top-down approach is how I tend to see these kinds of things. So, site-based interpreter programs, these could be coordinated through a lot of the volunteer groups along with the agencies. And so that's in many ways is what has come in the door here with these proposals. But I think if, we have a separate part of our recommendation packet that goes to OPAC that kind of outlines some of these broader thematic recommendation ideas. I think that that's a necessary component of our task here to make recommendations about how to improve management at these sites, whether or not they have a Rocky Habitat designation or not.
Charlie, I think I saw your hand going up. Did you want to comment on this?
No, I wanted to mention a couple of things, both for those who proposed a lot of recommendations around things that maybe were conditions that went away. And that's why I really want to get at this, because I don't think that the wildlife disturbance issue went away because Parks said that we have existing rules for that. That's why somebody offered up a different management recommendation. And just because it's not something that we're comfortable with at this time or we understand how to use, we do need to address that concern that the public has brought forward in a proposal. And so I think these are different strategies at getting at that concern. And so for the public out there proposing sites and thinking about some of those conditional things that maybe came out of, I feel like these are some ideas. And I think it's a great place and a great discussion point for this group too, on a site-by-site basis. What type of application is appropriate for which type of management concern? Largely around, I felt like what were around some wildlife disturbance issues and some trampling. But that's really all I would say. I think separately, I do have a coast-wide opinion, and that has to do with a volunteer program coast-wide. But on a very site-based level, as it relates to the proposals that we have looked at, I feel like these are good considerations for us, but also for the public as well when they're looking at those conditional things that we brought up. And the reason this is important for me to discuss and for all of us to discuss is that the public is clearly not satisfied with the rules and regulations, and we've asked them to come and tell you how to implement and how to do your job as state agencies better. And we're telling them, well, no, we already do that. Or no, we have bring us another rock. So I really feel like at some point we have to actively participate and help solving the problem that they've brought to us. And I feel like this is the best start, I could think of in coming up with ideas and how we start to crack those nuts if we're not comfortable with what they put in front of us.
Thanks, Charlie. And while it is important at a site level, and I think we do need to have focused ideas around each individual site, I do want to say that the idea of a coast-wide program that can help to coordinate and leverage amongst the different programs that can provide consistency across, those are the things that we talked about in our earlier kind of amendment work to part 3. And I think that, that is a recommendation I am really interested in seeing move forward, and calling to attention as a need that the state has that is currently unmet by the existing management framework. And so I feel like that is very important. I think there was another slide that we put together that had some of those ideas. But right now I just wanted to tee that up for this group. Like, we have focused the last 2 days on site-specific proposals and conditions and criteria. But I do think that a reasonable mix for how we move forward is potentially some sites, but potentially also a recommendation at the broad level that can help folks and basically foster a better observation, a better stewardship ethic for these sites that it's clear we all care dearly about. I see some hands up in the air. I recognize that we're getting kind of closer towards the end of our time today. So let's kind of go through these. So Walter, Tom, and then Dick.
Andy, just, I do have quite a few, I've been writing stuff down as we've been talking, but let's get through the slides, and then we can, I'm sure you might answer people's questions before we end. So can we just wait till the end, and then we'll kind of do a wrap up? Would that be better?
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. So the things that I've heard that cross-cut many of these proposals are the needs for something that could be supported by a statewide program of some kind that coordinates and helps at all of our Rocky Shore sites, not just any new proposals that make it through this list. And it could help by coordinating volunteer training. We've talked about the fact that for groups to be associated with state or U.S. Fish and Wildlife programs, there have to be vetting. Excuse me. So we would want to, as a part of a program, actually facilitate that to happen. So maybe the cost didn't come down to the individual site kind of management. We would want to come to agreement on some metrics that we would be kind of trying to understand at each of our sites, right? So, how many people are we talking to? And while we're not talking to people, are we observing events that we want to record as some kind of a baseline for our understanding about behavior at the sites? And we have to recognize that we're not working in a vacuum. There are programs that currently exist that are at a slightly smaller scale that do this. We've talked to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about the SEA program. The Haystack Rock Awareness Program has built a really good, program there based out of the North Coast, right? So we do have programs we can leverage and we can learn from, and we could use to create a consistent coast-wide kind of perspective and program. The other part of this is that, we can build a data infrastructure to support, as we're doing interpretation, observations, so that we create baselines at these sites. And I think that's really important, because the more we can use data to drive our decisions, the better. And then finally, we have to look, I think, beyond traditional sources, because we realize that as natural agencies, we may not have the capacity to build these things right now with just who's playing in our existing sandbox. And I see Dave Lacey's identified in the chat that ACFA is working on and is implementing a tide pool ambassador program. That's fantastic. So let's work to, and as a whole, I think if our group came out of this process, in addition to any recommendations for sites that move forward, for some kind of an appropriation, some kind of a structure, from a management perspective that could help us bridge the divide between where we are now and where we need to be, then that's really important. So I think that kind of covers the bullets that I have on this slide. And I'm curious to know how that resonates with the rest of the group. And I still see a bunch of hands up. So
Okay.
Walter, Tom, and Dick.
Andy, thank you much. Summed up everything that I've been thinking since this whole process started. I think one of the best outcomes was that we did get a lot of people focused on these areas, that there are a lot of protections already there, and that they might not be perfect. There are ways to getting at what these people want and what these groups want without creating more rules. I think that we can get there, and what you're just proposing is something that is something I think everybody can really get around. And personally, I live in Newport, but I find everything up north just as important as everything down south and in my front yard. And sometimes we have the tendency to just look what's in front of you, where you live and what's important to you, and forget what's important for the whole coast. And I think that this is a good way going forward to working on something coast-wide and getting programs that will address a lot of these proposers' concerns, and still having these sites up there for proposals and to look at them, but also a way to answer some of the questions that they brought forth, and hopefully solving some of their problems. So thanks for that, Andy, and thanks for the work group for all their work, and especially the state agencies. I know this is more work in your lap, so thank you and appreciate it.
Tom.
Yeah, I guess I'll echo what Walter just said. Thanks, Andy, for that review. Excuse me. What I'm sort of hearing is, this is taking me back to the earlier discussions about the what do we call it? The update to the strategy. All the discussions we had about policies that we recommended that I believe were adopted, and a lot of what I'm looking at looks like those policies. So things like, we should have coast-wide stewardship programs. We should invest in research. We should have these policies. So what it's kind of sounding like, excuse me, is that we established a set of policies that got adopted, and then that were sent out into the community through this site selection process. And what we're hearing back is those are good policies, because the communities have now sort of echoed them back to us and said, yep, those policies need to be implemented. And then the other running theme we've heard throughout the whole process is that we have limited capacity to implement those policies. We've heard that across the board from all the agencies. And not to put you on the spot, Andy, but did I hear you just use the word appropriation?
You did.
So that caught my ear, because what that sounds like is a recommendation from this group that, everything I just said, these policies were created by this group through a very long, involved process. The community was engaged. They were sort of approved, sent back out through a site process, which created sort of a reflection, a mirror back to us that, yeah, these are good policies. They need to be implemented. In order for them to be implemented, they need to have resources you can put behind them. And I guess what I'm curious about is, are we talking about a recommendation to provide the resources necessary to implement those policies? Because the policies have already been recommended and approved, right?
Technically, they still
Right
need to
about
be
that?
approved at LCDC, but the OPAC has already agreed.
Okay. So yeah, I'm just trying to like track sort of where we are, and I think that's where we are, and I think that also helps us with the challenge we have now, which is we've gotten a lot of site-specific proposals that are really calling out coast-wide policies that need resources to be properly implemented. And I think, you know, maybe this was a little bit frustrating, but in the end, maybe a good exercise of sort of ground truthing our ideas about what policies we needed. And now what we've heard back from our communities is, yes, we do need those policies, and they need to be resourced so they can be properly implemented. So I guess that's kind of what I'm going to take home from this. There's a few things I would add in there, I guess, from my sort of, you know, if I'm supposed to be paying attention to research, I would like to see that reflected here, because we can have all kinds of interpretive programs, and I think I'm fully on board with that, super important. But I also think it's super important that we invest in the work we need to do to figure out how we're going to deal with these major changes that are headed our way. We talked a lot about climate change, sea level rise, acidification. Now we're dealing with this kelp deforestation issue. These things are going to keep coming at us. Seeds are wasting. And I really think we got to invest in the resiliency that we need to make sure there's a rocky habitat there to teach people about. So I'll end there, but I guess I'm getting signals from the boob tube that some people think that what I said made sense. I hope it did. The end of a long day and a long week, but thanks for hearing me out on that. Back to you, Andy.
Thanks, Tom. I saw a lot of heads nodding. Dick?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I'm glad I didn't have to actually hold my arm up for the last hour and a half, as opposed to just having the digital hand up. So anyway, I had originally raised my hand back when we were talking about how to deal with recommended sites and all these things. And I think maybe I'll just let the sleeping baby stay asleep as opposed to waking it up again. I think that's the recommendation of parents, is never wake a sleeping baby. But I think just that basically, you know, we are going to be getting public comments. That's great. I think we shouldn't be fearful of public comments. We've been looking for the public interaction in this process from the get-go. The idea that the public are all going to comment on specific proposals, I think, is probably a fallacy. There's probably going to be some people who are looking more at the program overall, which is great. Kind of getting at these things, the site-wide recommendation ideas, and what's been talked about recently, I think, in particular, is that the public has become re-engaged again in rocky habitats. And that's the thing that really, I think, I was looking for at the get-go, is just as Tom noted too. These sites have changed dramatically since 1994. They're going to continue to change, and both from the numbers of people who are here and interested in them, as well as just all the things from ecologically that are coming at them. So I think that's been a real success. And we asked the public to engage, obviously, to send a site nomination. So we are getting what we asked for, which is terrific. And I don't think we need to be worried about getting it perfect. This is a classic case of not letting the perfect get in the way of the good. We've got a lot of good recommendations for sites, a lot of things that maybe need some minor tweaking. People maybe misunderstood things. Just heard Andrea talk earlier, saying that a little bit of clarification fixed some of the ideas in her head, some of the issues that came up. So I'm hoping that some of the comments that come in are going to be clarifications that are going to be maybe easy fixes. There's other ones that are going to be some of the issues that we raised on some of these sites. I won't say they're fatal flaws, but they were big issues that you just can't fix over the course of a couple of weeks. I mean, whether it's like, oh yeah, I need to go out and get partners, or how do I deal with this access? I mean, these are huge issues that are going to take, as Scott was leaning more towards the multiple months to fix. But I think in general, we got the public engaged, which is great. We got some great recognition for some sites that many of us already knew about, and we were looking to see if they're going to get proposed. So it's been a win so far, and I really liked Dave Lacey's ideas with his classic Spanish spelling of ambassador programs up and down the coast too, of just the realization that we have volunteer programs and ways to fund some of these things that are going to be doing some of these issues that we were looking for all along. So I'm encouraged to see that kind of, again, grassroots efforts that are going to maybe address some of these things that we're saying. Be great to have statewide programs, but we don't know how to fund them. Well, I think Dave is pointing out that some of these things can be looked at. We're going to grow them organically as we've done in the state for many years. So thanks. I'll let the rest of the sleeping babies stay asleep.
Thanks, Dick. As a father of twins, the dude abides. Charlie, you have your hand up.
Well, I'd echo a lot of what Dick just said, but particularly for these statewide recommendation ideas, things like tide pool ambassadors and otherwise, it's near and dear to my heart to try and accelerate those ideas. I've used that in discussion point often throughout the strategy update, is that I believe that people in the field are far better than rules and regulations many times. And in some cases, rules and regulations may be necessary, but we really need to understand and define expectations for those things so that we don't create more rules and regulations that don't work, that don't do what they're supposed to do. And I think that's really what like a management program is about, is not saying that we're going to create another sticker for wildlife disturbance, but we're going to measure it and we're going to watch the effectiveness on a site-by-site basis. And so I think that's some of the real value that comes in us thinking about these big ideas that address things that have, been in the strategy as a concern since, really the early 80s. So I think it's important for us to go there, and I'm excited that we're talking about this. And I also just want to recognize the, amazing amount of current and existing opportunities that we can leverage off of. We're very fragmented in our approach to the Rocky habitat when it comes to leveraging the resources in the communities. And we could be more synergized. And I think that takes some leadership and it takes money. And that's really clear that it's going to take leadership and money. But I think those sources are there. And we could really do, building off of the existing programs and existing work and existing agencies, we could go a long ways if we were just a little more organized and coordinated and better funded. I'm fully behind an OPAC recommendation around appropriation. I think that with any type of additional agency programming, that's what you're talking about. You look back at other recommendations from OPAC, those took, legislation and program funding, or maybe they don't take legislation, but they take some funding to make that program real. So I hope that's a real part of the recommendation that we're able to come up with at the end of the day, or at very least OPAC is.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Dave Fox.
Yeah, let me start with a mic check. Could you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, good. Yeah, I know I kind of come in and out. I echo what folks have said so far. I did want to maybe just recognize that virtually all the proposals that we got had both a carrot and stick component to them. So they identified wildlife disturbance, and virtually all of them recognized the need for interpretive programs and stewardship programs, education, whatever you want to call them, as a means to help alleviate the wildlife disturbance issues. So and most of our review, a lot of it focused on the sticks, that some of the proposed regulations that we as agencies we saw were either difficult or maybe in some cases not possible to implement, and had lots of concerns and such. And I guess I don't really have a conclusion to this other than that if if the proposals came in with, a primary goal or a goal of, alleviating wildlife disturbance, if we pull the sticks out of those proposals, I feel like they're still valid because they have the interpretive program, and that's, we're saying right now that that's probably the primary way to do this. And I think it is, because to me, the only regulatory way of alleviating wildlife disturbance is something extreme, that basically stops access in some way. And, it's our primary principle. It's almost like our prime directive, that we have access and we allow access. So if you can't stop access, the only other thing you could do really is have, these carrot programs, these interpretive programs that bring people in. So I think it's a good idea from a statewide standpoint, but I also wanted to recognize that pretty much all the proposals said that as well. Thanks.
Dave, I appreciate the birds behind you and your jabbering.
Is that hand raised again, Dave Fox? No, okay. And just to confirm, Scott, you do not still have your hand in the air. All right. Moses, could you just maybe think about wrapping us up with your next steps for the group and maybe one more look at that calendar, or at least covering the next steps?
Sure. So as we covered at the top of the meeting yesterday in graphical form, but here we see a little more laid out, but I just want to remind everybody where we're headed. So the next thing will be preparing those recommendation summary documents. So those will be drafted and sent around to the working group for review. So we're operating on a very tight timeline here. We do want to get that 30-day public comment period going. It'll start as soon as these recommendation summary documents are reviewed and posted on organocean.info for people to respond to. So we're going to be burning the midnight oil to get that done and turned around out to folks sometime in the next couple weeks. Also, we're going to be scheduling some working group meetings now, likely for April, potentially March as well. We'll see. But I think how I envision it at the moment is we're going to need at least one meeting to discuss revisions to the strategy that aren't necessarily related to the proposals we have in hand right now. And then part of revising that strategy as well, we're going to talk about how we need to revise this process. So obviously, folks have a lot of ideas out there about how this process should be working. So we're going to have to continue that discussion in an additional meeting and really hammer it out to see how this process could really be improved for future iterations when potentially none of us are involved in it. And then we're going to have to have a separate meeting likely, and that's going to be our final recommendation meeting. So that's where we're going to be once we've had a chance to review that public comment, which of course will be summarized and packaged for the working group and sent out well ahead of that meeting. Give you some time to digest that. And then come prepared to make your final recommendations at that meeting. That will likely be sometime in mid to late April, depending on how our schedules line up. And then, at the same time going on in the background there is preparation of all of our evaluation materials in their final forms. That's still going on right now, and will be part of that full recommendation packet that we'll be submitting to OPAC at least 2 weeks ahead of their May meeting, which is again looks like will be most likely on May 17th. So aiming to get that sent out to them by at least say May 1st, no later than hopefully. And then OPAC of course will hold their meeting and make their recommendations about which of these sites will move forward for consideration by the Land Conservation and Development Commission. And looks like potentially that will happen in their September meeting. Any questions about the next steps of our process here?
Laurel and then Andrea.
I just had a question about that. You said that we're going to have one meeting and then we're going to have another meeting. I just want to make sure that there's enough time in between those meetings, because if I need to vet stuff with a bunch of people, I need time to be able to do that. So just, I know that it's a limited time frame, but if there can be time in between those meetings that allows for me to come to the final meeting prepared to give the agency perspective, because it's not my perspective, perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
otherwise you won't, I'll not be able to vote.
Right. Well, we'll definitely keep that in mind. I guess it'll just depend in large part on everyone's availability in scheduling those meetings. I think it will be wise for us to, again, schedule another overflow or contingency meeting somewhere in there as well. So depending on how everyone's schedules line up, we'll see what the possibility is for doing that in case we have other unfinished business that we need to attend to at some point, either with proposals or with strategy revisions.
Andrea, Carrie, and then Dave Fox.
Thanks. And maybe that's the intent of bullet point number 3, but I would like to make a suggestion that we do whatever process revisions at a separate meeting than us making our final recommendations. That is a lot to do. And in preparation for whatever conversation that we're going to be having about how to adaptively manage this process, we don't have to have an answer right now, but I would really love it if there was a way to get feedback from the people who submitted the proposals, because I'm sure that they have a lot of really good suggestions on ways to improve. And I don't want it to be a one-sided. I'd really like to have that feedback loop and that continuous improvement model. So however we can orchestrate that, but I think it's really important.
Thanks, Andrea. No, that's definitely the right idea, and that to discuss the strategy revisions in a separate meeting from our final recommendation meeting. So all of that, there's other lesser tweaks to the strategy, and then I think the biggest thing though is going to be revisiting the structure and framework of this process and how we want it to play out in future iterations.
Carrie?
My comment is very similar. I was just wanted to know how during the public comment period we can get feedback on the process itself for those who considered submitting a proposal, who did submit a proposal, what the process was like for them and how they could see it being better. So, just making sure we capture that.
Yeah, that would be great, Carrie, and hopefully folks listening in today have that in mind. I think a lot of our members of the public who've been engaged have done a really good job about keeping our attention focused on the process and getting the process right. So I definitely anticipate some of that, but we'll definitely try to encourage that everywhere we can.
So Dave Fox and then Charlie.
Yeah, I almost had the exact same comment about the separating the meetings. I'd like us to consider, kind of the compressed block of time we have here, and if possible, if we could do the process meeting, while the public comment is still going on, so that that's a block of time where we don't have other Rocky Shores related, Rocky Habitat related meetings. So in March sometime. Otherwise, we're going to really compress a lot of meetings into the first week or two of April. It's going to be tough from a scheduling standpoint.
I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, and that might be at odds with getting input on the process, but maybe if we could make it, I don't know, toward the end of the public coverage, so something where we have a block of time when we're free from other Rocky Habitat work. The other kind of quick question I have is I noticed on my calendar Monday it's coming Monday the 1st. I have two time blocks set aside for potential rocky habitat meetings. Is that something, some artifact? I don't even know what that is anymore.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look as well. I have those on my calendar as well. I think that was something that came out of our agency meetings earlier in January.
It was an
Okay,
agency huddle, and you guys anticipated that whatever happened after the vote at the end of the day, you guys were going to have some stuff to deal with as state agencies, and so y'all needed to huddle up and debrief about what happened. So that's what we put on the calendar.
That's how I remember it as well.
Or to be
Okay, well, there's two time blocks, so it'd be good to narrow it down
Yeah.
to, to one.
Yeah, I'd like to choose the afternoon one for you agencies on the phone. So
that would be best for me.
I think it was because Andrea had a conflict with legislative session that we had the two set aside.
I actually only have one on my calendar, which is the morning. What time was the afternoon one again?
It's at 3 o'clock.
I do have a 3:30 meeting with a representative, and which is probably why I asked for the morning session. I could meet from 4 to 5 if you guys need to do it in the afternoon, or yeah.
Well, I don't think everyone needs to be on the line
Okay,
for this
sorry.
conversation. Let's just
Sorry.
take this to email and sort it out there.
My apologies.
Yeah, that's okay. Charlie, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of build off of Andrea and Dave's point. Definitely separate those meetings on process. I'm really going to harp on the state agencies who carry a big part of the weight in this to think very carefully about recommendations around process, because it's really important, because you either do a lot of work on these proposals on the front end, or you do a lot of work on the back end, or there's an iterative process. And there's limitations to that process and capacity. And I think one of the biggest and most important ones is that if we're asking the public to come and tell you how to do your job and give you suggestions on your job, there really needs to be a strong iterative process there. If there's the expectation for the public to just understand how the agency works and operates. And so this is why, we found ourselves, and you guys heard me for a year and a half saying process over proposals, and we're swimming in proposals and we don't have a great process. And so just moving forward, we need to be very deliberate and careful and thoughtful. And I do invite all of the public as well to give us feedback on that. That's really important. And I am the first to recognize that we did not build the perfect plane here, and we're barely flying through the air, and we're doing it, and we're doing all right. And I think that I'm pretty excited that we've gotten these proposals as far as we have, and the public engaged as far as they have. So, but let's be really thoughtful on moving forward, because I think we owe that to the public, and we owe that to the Rocky Habitats.
Charlie, I think that's maybe just a fantastic note to end on. It's been a long day and a half. I want to take the opportunity to thank everyone who's been tuning in from their desks, wherever they are, and to thank the working group members for all of the time and energy and effort. Frank, thanks for your help facilitating. We'll certainly need you as we go forward to OPAC. And I think unless anybody has anything else substantive, then we should adjourn a few minutes early. Thank you all. I appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.